please get ready to be challenged and inspired by our closing speaker, Ashley Alvarado, as she shares with us how good intentions aren't good enough, the value of engagement, journalism, DEI, and the value of getting uncomfortable. I think we've had a lot of discomfort, hopefully, in these last 2 days, and that's good. And Ashley is going to tell us more about that. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Courtney Hurd, who will introduce Ashley. Courtney.
Thank you, Fran. Hello, everyone. My name's Courtney. I'm the program manager for Newsmatch. And it's actually with a lot of pleasure that I get to introduce Ashley Alvarado today. She's currently the Director of Community Engagement at Southern California Public Radio, which includes KPCC and now the LAist digital publication. And prior to my role at INN, I actually worked for Detroit's public radio station, and we would frequently look to her work really as an example of a public media organization that's willing to change what they do to really serve and reach a broader audience. Among some of Ashley's efforts is a live community-centered storytelling series called Unheard LA, and Feeding the Conversation, which is an ongoing event series designed to bring together community members and journalists to inform KPC's coverage so it's more relevant and reflective of local residents. As Fran mentioned, today she's going to be speaking with us about the value of discomfort and how we should really work to embrace it as part of the process of building more inclusive and equitable news organizations. As a heads up, there'll be time at the end for Q&A. So while she's speaking, feel free to just drop your questions in the chat and I'll be keeping track of them. And without further ado, Ashley.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for having me. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. This is also the time at which I do the disclaimer in saying that at any point there may be a cameo by a 6-year-old or a 69-year-old. Last week, my son felt it was very relevant to come in during a panel conversation, and it is what it is. So thank you again for having me. As Courtney said, I'm the Director of Community Engagement at KPCC LAist, which are operated by Southern California Public Radio. I'm also really honored to be the board president of a nonprofit called Journalism That Matters, which looks to support conversations and information ecosystems and communities so that communities and democracy can thrive. And at any point in this conversation later, if you want to ping me to talk, ask a question, please feel free to reach out on Twitter. And at the end, I'll have my email address too. So I think, I really got to focus more time today than I did yesterday, unfortunately. And I've appreciated the ways in which folks have embraced those moments of discomfort. And I really opened up asking the questions that are hard and that are awkward. And I have to say, welcome to the club. I grew up in a town called Eugene, Oregon. And sort of the deep, dark secret that I had coming into nonprofit work was that I did not grow up listening to public radio in the backseat of my parents' car. I probably watched countless hours of Sesame Street and every possible viewing of Anne of Green Gables on OPB, but I don't know that I ever knew the name of our local NPR station growing up. When I eventually did land there on the dial, I didn't feel invited to its coverage. I didn't hear stories like mine, voices that sounded like mine, or anything that resembled my experience. Growing up Asian and Latina in a town that was 92% white, I was hungry to see my experiences reflected anywhere. My sister and I, though incredibly supported by our extended family, grew up the perpetual others. Where are you from? Are you mixed? I always say mixed kids are the cutest. Why don't you go back to China? These are questions that I got a lot of. I was maybe 9 years old when an older kid cracked an egg on my head and suggested I return to a country that I'd never once visited. This was down the hall from a sign proclaiming our school a racism-free zone. A few years later, and 2 hallways over, I earned my first byline as part of the Cyberbeak News, and I was hooked. I'll always remember my grandma Murdy and how she'd write our hometown paper anytime she was upset with the way things were going. The register guard was, for her, a trusted friend and advocate. The more I learned about the possibilities of journalism, the more I saw the kinds of ways in which access to information created agency. And I really wanted to be a part of that with the kind of passion that you can only possess in middle school. I wanted to be part of creating accessible pathways to information. Anybody who's heard me talk before has probably heard me talk about information being our greatest weapon and be our own best advocates. And at the time, or even when I was in college, though, I have to say that I never knew that there was any possibility that a position like mine would exist. So I bring to my work in community engagement a lifetime experience, like so many who have been in the conversations of the last 2 days, as an outsider, of code switching, and of communicating across differences. And that's one reason that I think that this Sandra Cisneros quote has always resonated with me so much. Engaged journalism at its essence is the work of closing the gap between communities and the journalists who aim to serve them. And in this moment, those gaps have become gulfs. I have these pictures here, probably don't need any of them because we all know what's going on, that we are still in the early days of much overdue national reckoning with the systemic racism that has for hundreds of years shaped the everyday experiences of people living in the United States. This reckoning, a reexamination of who holds power, what abuses have transpired, and what opportunities have been lost has coursed its way through every industry, of course, including journalism. And this comes more than 50 years after the Kerner Commission called out the media's lack of diversity and complicity in maintaining systems of oppression. Newsrooms must now own to and address institutionalized racism that has framed their communities, coverage, and workplaces for generations. Like I had said in the description of this conversation, we know that public media is no different. We know that nonprofit media is no different. But we also know, and I think have to recognize, that there's a particular satisfaction that comes from doing mission-driven nonprofit work. We can and often do extol its virtues. We emphasize the word public, and we relish an exceptionalism that can only come from not being in it for the money. But break through the layer of hyper woke self-satisfaction, and there's some really the updated manifesto from Stephanie Fu was mentioned in the last conversation, and there's language there too of going, we know we're in it for the right reasons, but we can't let those right reasons or that satisfaction that comes from that cloud our ability to see the systemic racism that we're also living in and often complicit in. And so when you cut through that, that's when you start to see the startling lack of diversity. You see newsrooms grappling with institutionalized racism and having to figure out what they're willing to give up to get things right. Mission statements and best intentions are not enough to combat the implicit bias that inequity newsrooms must now confront. Instead, there must be an embracing of deep listening, a willingness to get uncomfortable, and a full-throated commitment to the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The folks who have spoken before me in the last 2 days bring a wealth of experience and understanding the space, and I mean I've been inspired and I've just learned a ton in the time that I've been on with all of you. So in the time that I have left and whatever I'm keeping you from getting to next, I want to just talk a little bit about how engaged journalism has approached, how engaged journalism has informed my approach to doing DEI work more recently at KPCC and LAist, and to think about what the overlaps are, and also just the dangers and the possibility when we get it wrong or when we get it right. Something that a way that I've talked about it more recently when it comes to engaged journalism and a need to understand the ethics involved in it is we invite such vulnerability. Right now in the conversations that we're having with our colleagues, the conversations that we're having with our audiences, there's a different level of rawness. And so I tend to think of it in the way that you would, if this is, I need to come up with a better way of describing it, but if you think about dropping a fork on somebody, it's going to hurt, but it's not going to cause permanent damage most likely. If you drop a fork on somebody mid-surgery when their stomach's cut open, it's catastrophic. And so how do we know that about engaged journalism? How do we know that about the rawness that people are experiencing right now with this reckoning, with the conversations we're having, with the decision that was made today, and let that sort of weight inform our actions? So getting into, probably should have started with this, but getting into what some shared language is around engaged journalism, I find it's helpful to just to know what I'm talking about before we get into some of the methodology or the principles of it. And so, as I said before, at its heart, I see engaged journalism as closing the gap between communities and the journalists who aim to serve them. Is thinking about who is not currently consuming your journalism. Oftentimes it's about thinking differently about story selection, framing, and distribution. We've done quite a bit of work with human-centered design at KPCC. And one of the things that really allowed me to understand more is, as journalists, we focus on that word journalism, right? We think about the product, we think about the packaging. In radio, we think about the sound bites. But for people who most need information, they're thinking about information. And so how can we make sure that we're identifying in the work we do who most needs information and how we get it to them? And so with that, it's come up to, that's allowed us to think about non-traditional distribution. Some folks heard from documented and hearing about WhatsApp. If you think about outlier and using texting, if you think about opportunities to do direct mail distribution, all of that is about saying we're going to be a little bit less precious about the packaging and instead prioritize needs. And then shaping stories with community. So all of these are ways that I tend to think about engaged journalism. And while I did share some examples, I think it's really critical to understand that engagement can manifest in as many ways as there are needs. And so when we start to think about how does that inform diversity, equity, inclusion work, just think about, like, we have to be agile in our approaches. We have to have sort of a design do mindset, and that we're going to see what works and we're going to move forward as long as we're taking a responsible approach and doing all of it. So I wanted to use this time to really talk about the lessons that I am bringing from my work in engagement to the work I'm now doing as part of a task force at KPCC looking at diversity, equity, inclusion. Lesson number one, and this is one that can seem really simple, but I've heard it come up already in the conversations today, and that is to listen, to embrace it as our superpower, and to think about the ways that we can do that internally and externally. If we're really interested in learning and serving our audiences, we have to begin by knowing them. If we want to change what's going on in our newsrooms, we have to start by listening and having, listening in that it's the process of being open and absorbing what's there, but making sure that you're demonstrating how you're listening. And this is something that we can bring to our everyday practices, to our meetings, to our performance reviews, and understanding that people need to, it's human nature, right? Like, you want to be seen, you want to feel supported in your identities and in your workplace. There are a lot of resources on how to improve this, and I want to shout out just a few, but not all, because there are just too many and my font would get really, really small. If you're not familiar with complicating the narrative and the process of looping, I know I've seen some SJN folks on here today. I highly recommend checking it out. The graphic on the left is from them. Thinking about different kinds of facilitation. Journalism That Matters, as I mentioned, is an organization that I'm president of, and we practice something called open space technology, which is at the heart of Unconference. There's also a practice, if anybody's trying to better understand the experiences of colleagues or how you can work together, a woman named Tova Averbach in Israel developed something called organizational kaleidoscope that I highly recommend. If you're wanting to look at the intersections of DEI and engagement, Gather is a community of practice for engaged journalists, and you can learn about that at letsgather.in. And then Open News, which is producing and supporting the work of INN for this convening, has a DEI coalition that it announced during SourceCon earlier this summer, and that you can Google to learn more. With listening, very closely tied to that is own what you don't know, and this is when we start to get into some of that discomfort that that Courtney and Fran alluded to, and you have to listen to understand, and you have to have a willingness to have your assumptions challenged. This comes from the definition of empathy that's used in design thinking. So knowing that you're going into a conversation, I often make the distinction between safe spaces and welcoming spaces, because you want to be able to go into a conversation, feel supported, feel like you are there and that people are listening, but you also want to be able to go in, or you ought to be able to go in with an understanding that you might come out changed. So I think it's absolutely critical to approach listening and to approach the work of DEI, owning what you don't know. There have been some really honest questions in the chat so far. And those are questions that until you get answered, you can't necessarily move forward in better supporting colleagues across identities, in more effectively engaging audiences that you haven't traditionally served as well. And so so getting through that and finding the spaces and the times to ask those questions are absolutely critical. With that, you understand that your audiences, your communities, your colleagues know a lot. Look for this is the one slide that I just kept changing all morning because like Stephanie Thu's new update came out, or thinking about the different articles that people are talking about, looking at what Maynard Institute has offered with fault lines as far as identifying the audiences that you and the biases that may be coming up in your everyday journalism that you're not thinking about, looking at the work that Press On has led and that Lewis Raven Wallace has really been fantastic in supporting. And then also just the newsletters, what's coming out, what can be in your inbox every day to broaden your awareness of the conversations that are happening across the industry and outside in complementary spaces. All of that said, do not ask other people to do the work for you. There has to be an understanding of what starts with you. And there are ways to have conversations, to create spaces where you can start to invite folks to share, but do not put this work on others. That is something that we've experienced time and again with our engagement work, and then just increasingly in conversations around equity, inclusion, and diversity. I know folks got to hear from Mitra earlier, but I just have to say that the story that Mitra did about looking to yourself first before you're trying to fix your newsroom, I think is an absolutely critical resource and another example of the opportunity to start in your own work. And when we're talking about discomfort, when we're talking about being uncomfortable, know that uncomfortable and unsafe are not the same thing. And when you can make that distinction, it allows you to do a lot more and to learn a lot more. There is, and some folks have heard, there are times when engagement goes wrong. And I think there are times when and we can get into more examples of, I will get into more examples of that in a minute, but I'm thinking of one particular time where some of my colleagues came back and said, I felt attacked. I felt unsafe. I felt like I came in here to do something good and people turned on me. And I'm so grateful to one colleague in particular, because after this day, which was a very long and traumatic and relationship changing day with a number of my colleagues, that particular colleague, we got into a conversation and he identifies as white cisgendered male. And I turned to him and I said, were you unsafe or were you uncomfortable? And he paused and he said, I was uncomfortable. And in that moment, it not only probably saved our relationship, but it was that opportunity for us to talk about, okay, well, what you felt for 8 hours is what so many of us have felt for every day of our life. And getting to get into that space where we had a deeper understanding of each other, it just changed things, because then we could say, okay, knowing this, we can move forward in the work and in a deeper, more honest kind of way. This is something that I'm guessing many people have had conversations around, and it's something that I catch myself saying multiple times a day, and it's just trying to get to an understanding that intent and impact are not the same thing. So the way that you're intending, just like we did in that event that went so wrong, just because you have the best of intentions, just because you think that this is going to result in a really rich conversation or story or event, does not mean that that is how people experience it. In the conversation with Lee and Mitra, there's the question of, do you ask a colleague for insights? Do you ask somebody to sort of inform this? And there have been times for us recently in some of our content that also had a diversity, had a focus on anti-racism and all of that, where, we made the decision, we're not going to go back to somebody and ask them to renegotiate trauma. We're not going to go back to somebody and for the entertainment of others say, can you tell me what it's like to have this racism, expressed to you in this way or that. Instead, we're going to find other ways where we can maybe revisit a conversation, but know that how folks experience it and how we intended aren't necessarily the same. So we can be more collaborative in our approach of getting there. And I think it's also important to say that when you fixate on the intent, that in itself is an act of privilege. one of the ways that I've started to talk about intent and impact is just sort of thinking about any time you're going to get beamed by something in the face. So in this GIF, it's looking at, this guy thought he was going to score a goal. Like, that's what he's going for, right? It doesn't change the fact that this other guy got hit in the face with a soccer ball. And so if you go and just say, well, I was trying to hit a goal, like, it doesn't stop the pain, it doesn't stop the hurt. And you can think about that every time you catch yourself thinking about saying something like, I never meant any harm. It wasn't my intent. I'm sorry you felt that way. How can we instead say, okay, I recognize my actions, I recognize the hurt, and we can move from there. This is something that allows us to have more honest, more sincere relationships with community members that we're working to engage, and to move away from the transactional. And for anybody who is familiar with Gather, Andrew Devagal is, oh gosh, his titles have changed, but he's at the Agora Journalism Center at the University of Oregon. Agora partnered with Journalism That Matters to have the experience engagement and later the Elevate engagement conferences in 2015 and 2017. And he's written quite a bit about transactional versus relational. And what I appreciate when you think about how so many newsrooms have approached engagement of, we can put a call out on social, we can crowdsource this, we can add a poll at the end. You're really thinking about super transactional interactions. And then that happens in conversations about how do we bring DEI to the fore of what we're doing in newsrooms or in content, because it's then saying, well, we'll hire somebody. Martin Reynolds from the Maynard Institute has talked about diversity it's an action, but you're trying to work your way towards equity and inclusion. So how can we think about going beyond the transactional or the superficial to recenter, or to sometimes to decenter one particular perspective in order to allow for more, to have community, to have relationship at the center of all we're doing. I've been working with a DEI professional out of the University of Southern California, and I've really appreciated what she said as far as in order to do really meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion work, you have to first unlearn, relearn, and then do. And so what if we did that with these principles centered with everything that we're trying to get done? Another thing that I heard folks talking about earlier today, and that I think is absolutely critical, this is a version of a slide that I share every time I'm talking to college students, is this understanding that going into engagement work, going into the conversations that so many in newsrooms are having right now, we have to understand that nobody is starting with a blank slate. I bring to my work a childhood of not feeling heard. I bring to my work the sensitivities that come with that. And so that for me is what drives me. It's what makes me want to avoid others having that experience. It's also why I'm really bad at ever saying no to any college speaking invite, because I want folks to get to, I had very few teachers of color. I want people to see that. So that informs it for me. But if you're going in to do engagement work or to do journalism or to do any kind of, and I guess I should say engagement as far as engaged journalism or just in getting to know colleagues, understand that people are coming in with all of the microaggressions and macroaggressions that they have experienced up until that point. And so whatever actions you're taking are going to be informed by that lens. And so that's also part of what happens with this intent versus impact, right? Like it just might be that trust has been lost and you're starting at a deficit. Or it might be that somebody is coming from a place of just so much privilege or so much inexperience in a certain space that you have to really set up that foundation first. And it can be tough, but it's what it's knowing that, it's understanding the landscape that I think allows you to have a baseline and then to set your goals. Similarly, we have to just recognize that in every relationship, there is a power dynamic. I think of going back to that no good, terrible, no good, terrible, very bad day of engagement experience that we had. There was our participant who came to me afterward and said, Ashley, I'm never going to say no to KPCC. Like, this was a horrible, traumatic day, but I'm never going to say no because you're at a newsroom that could make my career. And if you pay attention to me, then others are going to pay attention to me, and that's going to allow me to do a lot more. And that moment has stuck with me because as somebody who deals with a daily suffer from imposter syndrome, I'm always thinking about how did they accidentally leave the door open and I got in. I actually wield a ton of power by having the organizations in my email signature, and that happens in our workplaces too. And so I'm really particularly grateful of the ways in which Susan expressed it this morning, much more eloquently than I ever could. But I think as we're taking this work, we have to be mindful of what power we've assumed, what power we're sometimes, in the way that they talk about. I don't know if anybody went to their high school counselor and the high school counselor said, like, there are a lot of scholarships that go unused every year. There's a lot of power that goes unused every day in our organizations. And so how can we make the decision that we're going to go after that and create changes that are lasting and that allow more people to thrive. Going back to the idea of information, in some of the research we've done, what I've appreciated was we realized so many of our existing audiences listen to us to thrive. But what about the audiences we're not reaching who need information to survive? And how can we reorient toward that goal to do more? And then how do we think about that as far as our own workplace culture? How do we reorient to make sure that our colleagues are thriving too? And a big part of this, and I feel like it sort of goes without saying, is that the decisions we make, when, like, the leadership that we demonstrate when we decide to give over power. And I am not a fan of the term empower, because I think that it's just an assertion of privilege as opposed to an acknowledgement of it. But I do think that if we understand what happens when we recognize what we have at our disposal, and then we have a willingness to give that over, we can do really great stuff. And so that can mean having a leadership change, having a change in leadership because the time is now. It can show up in your content. And so this is a project that we launched this year, and it was not meant to be a year-long project, but it ended up being one because of the pandemic. But we looked at how do we center the parent experience in Los Angeles, and we thought about, okay, what do we as a newsroom bring to the table, and what do parents bring to the table? I know that can start to sound transactional, and I should say that the one time that I do like talking about engagement as transactional is just in the development of social capital, because it gives you room to make mistakes. The same thing too, like, unless we have organizations where people feel cared, we're not ever going to have a soft landing when there is something that goes wrong. But in this case, it was looking at how can we really center parent experiences. And Mariana Dell, the early childhood reporter, and Stephanie Rotopper, the early childhood engagement producer, came together and worked on this effort where we trained a dozen parents on how to take photos. We trained many of them on how to keep audio diaries, or maybe all of them actually. And then we produced this digital gallery. And the reason I bring it up here is that every time Stephanie and Mariana felt tempted or started to write a narrative about the parents' experience, they stopped. And we said, these parents know, they're now taking these amazing portraits of their everyday life. They're sharing their stories. Let's let them stand on their own. And so it was this great restraint on the journalist's part that I think allowed for some of the most original and compelling storytelling that we've had on our site so far. And then Courtney had mentioned a live storytelling series that we do that is pretty much the thing that keeps me going because it's just such a magical experience, that's called Unheard LA. And I bring this up because something I've learned through this process is What happens when you make the invitation for folks to reflect their experience and have the self-control to not ask anybody to represent something beyond that? Because through this work, we've been able to explore Los Angeles one story at a time and to create this nuance and connections that we just didn't know were possible. In this and in engagement, it's really easy to get lonely in the work. If you're the only person in your newsroom who's trying, if you're somebody who has spent a lot of emotional labor for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years trying to affect change, it can get lonely. And so I just have to recommend looking for that community of practice, finding your people, and knowing that they're there. The people who are in this space right now, folks on Gather, folks in the Journalism in Color Slack, folks at Open News. There are a ton of really fantastic people to know. And the last thing I want to say is embrace metrics. In engagement, when I started, we had no idea. We had no idea what success looked like because nobody has spent the time to define metrics. But as you're doing this work, look for what you can know. Is this a place where, how many referrals do you get from your colleagues? Like, are they recommending people to HR? If they're not, that tells you this isn't a place that they think other people would want to work at. Are you asking people if they feel supported across their identities? Are you looking to have parity with your region when it comes to demographics? Start to develop baselines so that you can develop goals, and then really look to how you can be held accountable and can hold others accountable too. And so with that, I will stop for questions. I told Courtney my goal was to end at the 45 mark. So I apologize if at any point I sounded like I was doing medical disclaimers at the end of a commercial.
Thank you, Ashley. As folks, you guys can post your questions in the chat, but I've got a few to sort of get us started. Like before an uncomfortable conversation is even had, it almost seems like there needs to be groundwork laid between that organization, building trust or having an open mind. So you kind of touched on this during your talk, but could you speak more about like the types of rules of operations that need to be in order before you even start,
So one thing I would do, if anybody wants to click away from my face and start Googling, is looking for the SourceCon Code of Conduct. What are the kinds of group agreements that you can have in place going into difficult conversations or setting the ground rules? In the task force that I'm part of, we took and I say that I mentioned the SourceCon one because the SourceCon one then leads to another of other links that have resources for developing your own code of conduct. And I know there are a ton of other resources out there too, but it's been really fantastic in the work we're doing because we know we're going to have uncomfortable conversations. We know that we're going to have disagreement, and thinking about the ways in which we can support ourselves to be successful coming out of it. There's also another exercise that I've been a part of where you can do this maybe as a facilitator, but I also will have this conversation with my family, and that is to name the characteristics of a healthy friendship. And then you go through and you name them: trusting, honesty, support, calling each other out on shenanigans. And then you say, can we commit to having these as sort of our ground rules for today or ground rules for this conversation? And so the more you get to collectively paint a picture or a model of what success in this case would look like, then you move into that conversation that way. I have to say, like so many, this is just a period of time where we were in a staff meeting last weekend talking about, it's not like it's one thing after another. It's one thing on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. And so also just getting to figuring out, again, this is the work you have to do on your own, right? But figuring out how you prioritize an empathetic approach to conversations, I think is critical, because you don't know what people are dealing with when they click off on that Zoom call. You don't know why somebody has their video off. This morning I was trying my very best to listen to Susan while also helping to administer a math test for a kid who does not like math. And then I'm trying to come and to be present and to look professional while hiding in my parents' guest bedroom. And so like, how do we know that so many of our colleagues are dealing with this at the same time and approach a conversation with that kind of support? I think it's really, really tough. The other thing, and that when my first experience in nonprofit news, I remember going to IRE, and somebody said, in the nonprofit space, if you're not telling people what you're doing, nobody knows you're doing it. And I remember feeling like, well, that's silly. Like, just do the work and you'll get credit for it. But that's not, especially when people are physically distant, you're not going to get credit for things people don't know you're doing. And so find the ways to support healthy enough communication that people will see the efforts you're making. The other thing I would say, and then it's always dangerous to ask me one question because I'll answer 7 you haven't asked. But the other thing I would just say is spend time learning the communication currencies of those you're trying to engage. One of the first things that we did in our task force was identify, are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? What do you feel comfortable doing? What do you not feel comfortable doing? And then we can have a dialogue of saying, you know what, like, I'm going to be there and support you this way, but this isn't necessarily how I best communicate. I lied. I'm going to say one other thing, and that's going to be there is, if anybody's ever heard of the idea of butterflies and bumblebees, there are going to be those folks who are bumblebees, and they cross-pollinate. They go from this space to this space to this space, and that's fantastic. But then there are also the butterflies, and just having their sheer presence makes a difference. And so honoring that and knowing that there's value in how each of us chooses to show up. And so that for me has been really helpful too.
Thank you. We've got a question from Sue, piggybacking off the note you said about how we measure our work and our impact in this area. How do you measure the community, impact of your work? She provided a few examples. In other words, do you see a change in listenership, on air or in person, in terms of the community, and if more people or a greater variety of communities feel engaged with KPCC's news, how do you just go about identifying shifts?
So there are a lot of, as many folks know, a number of us were in the Media Transformation Challenge program last year, formerly known as Sulzberger, and I appreciated going into that program because it really even more so forced me to identify metrics in order to measure success. But there are a ton of ways. Something that we started doing last year was tagging stories that were conceived of or produced through community engagement in our CMS. And then we looked at how those stories performed. And what we found is those stories had more unique readers, they had more engaged minutes, and then they had a higher percentage of local and loyal readers. And loyal and local for so many of our newsrooms is what we look for because it indicates somebody being ready to move into the membership space. We look at our RSVPs. One thing about Unheard LA, which really started as an experiment, and it is an experiment in like every sense of the word, from the fact that we had a three event pilot that just kept getting picked up. When we did our pilot, we got renewed for a full season through grant support. And then we went to go ask for another year of funding, and they said, well, actually, why don't you ask for 2? So that was an indicator that we were onto something. But also when we looked at our audiences, more than 80% of audiences were coming to one of our events for the very first time. So that was telling us, oh, we can engage more audiences. We can engage new folks. And this is coming from a company that's probably at this point done like 1,000 events. Another thing that is just great is you look at that audience, and that audience does not look like a traditional public radio audience. My favorite bit of criticism, and I probably shouldn't joke about this, but I'm still going to, my favorite bit of feedback we got after our first season was somebody said, you really didn't have any older white participants in your program. And it was just this thing of going, if that's what we're going to get dinged as a public radio station, then we will take that every day, because it's telling us that we have changed our approach in a significant way. The other thing that we started looking at last year, and still in a fairly informal way, was just what percentage of our foundation support cited our engaged journalism as a reason that they were giving. And I can tell you that it was 4 times bigger than the goal that I had set. So that was a pretty big indicator for us. And then also just, I didn't have I mean, Courtney, when we first met, like I was the engagement team, and now we have a team. And so I'm going to call that a metric too. But then going back to the DEI side of things, I think we have to find ways that we're regularly gauging from staff how supported they feel. We're regularly looking at what's the makeup of our organizations and our communities and how big that gulf is. We're looking at whether people do consider themselves ambassadors of the organization and feel like they think other people should work there. There are a lot of opportunities there too.
Thanks. I think that sometimes in this work, like you kind of spoke about this earlier, but many of us all agree that the importance of building more equitable news organizations, happens internally as well as the relationships that we renegotiate with our communities and our audience. I think there's consensus around that being important. That's why we're all here. But I think sometimes where people get stuck is like, how do I make that shift? Or what are some of the first steps that I need to do? So if you could, even if you could provide an example, like what are ways in which you've been able to shift, something that was done in one particular way in the past and reshape it and reshift it so that it is more equitable and more inclusive?
One thing I'll say is, like, if you're able to have that coalition of the willing and to do experiments together, and then to create I'm saying I want everybody to feel great, but I also think that it's really important to harness FOMO, like show people what success looks like and make them want it. And so we've had some really great projects and experiences at KPCC, which I want to say, like, we're very much a work in progress. I don't want to say that we're on the other side of this journey. We are all very much a work in progress. But identifying those experiments that then you can treat as a case study. If you look, there's a website, if you Google, I'm not sponsored by Google, but if you spend time looking up engagement at KPCC, you'll see a Medium page where we spend a lot of time doing case studies of our own work. And that's because one thing we realized is if we wanted to grow our engagement practice at KPCC, we needed to support the field of engaged journalism more generally, and however we could try to get excitement around that. And then to get to the super tactical, Courtney, I'd say one thing that we're working on right now, that was this idea I've had and just kept tabling it over and over again because it wasn't the right moment, and then I realized, like, no, this is the moment, is overhauling our style guide. What are the words? What is the language we use that is not inclusive? And then also part of it gets into, I think it's right when people bring up the idea of media literacy because there are opportunities to address that. At the same time, I think it's incredibly important, and there are folks like Madeline Bear on the call and others who have done an incredible job leading work on developing community literacy among organizations. So you have to do both. And when you have an effort like overhauling a style guide, this is something that can be a perfect combination of those two, because you're looking at what are the resources that are out there. And maybe if folks want, I can send some of the ones around more inclusive style guides. You can have it be participatory internally, but the way that we're planning to phase this is that we have news managers who are going through all these best practices that members of the engagement team have identified, or at least conversation starters. We're going to expand it to the whole newsroom, and then we're going back to our audiences and saying, like, what language resonates. I think the term, and there was a really great story recently looking at, like, why people say Latinx or Hispanic or Latino or all these different things, but like having conversation, because part of it's regional, part of it's generational, and as we're making decisions in our newsroom about what we're saying, how do we think about these terms and how they can turn people on or off? There are 2 examples, and then also, so I would actually say, listen to and or read your own content. So many people, and I'm very guilty of this, you're in an office all day and you don't know what is happening on your air. So spend some time listening and thinking about what is being said or printed or produced. Ages ago, when Jenny Rivera died, there seemed to be a need to announce her ethnicity every time a remembrance was aired. And it was a moment of going, we don't do this for other people. Why are we doing it now? Let's have that conversation about the othering that is happening in that moment. A few years ago, there was a story where the headline was, "It's National Coffee Day, and here's the Mexican drink you've never heard of but should." And in that, they were talking about café de huella. And in that moment, when you know that 22% of our audience is Latino, that half of our region is Latino, and you're identifying in that moment who you think our audience is and who you think our audience isn't. And whether or not that immediately resonates with somebody, it signals who this is for and who's not. So little things like that, I think, is an immediate step you can take. And then sign up for all the newsletters, sign up for all the Slacks, and just listen to what others are doing. And something that's really different now from 5 years ago is you don't have to say, I've got this really great idea, let's go on a limb and try it. You can say, hey, I've seen PBS SoCal do this, and I've seen KPCC do this, and I've seen El Timpano do this, and like let's talk about why that works and how we might bring some of those learnings here, because we do have that community of practice.
Great. Thank you, Ashley, for those examples, and really for just reminding us to fall into the discomfort. It's really great close to our convening.